I'm Big Don Luca, smoke you like my hookah. Pump fake right, then I step back in illusion. That's a boss move maneuver, billionaire entrepreneur. Mark Cuban on the viewer, put you rookies on a skewer. I stay shitting on you boys like I came up from the sewer. Used to have a lot of dollars, now I got a lot fewer. What you saying to me? I hope you save it for me. I'm about to kill the game, and I put it in my testimony.
Hi, welcome to the Mainstream Mavs podcast. This is your host, Will. I'm unfortunately not joined by my co-host, Jaron, as we have this sort of little penultimate lead up to free agency. He was not able to be in attendance. He's on a trip for the 4th of July, so we wish him the best. But unfortunately, he's missing a great time period. Christmas in the NBA. The Mavericks have a lot on their slate today. I believe at either 5 or 6 p.m. Eastern time. I need to check exactly which one's Eastern or Central time. But free agency starts. Deals can be verbally agreed to, of course. It is the moratorium, so they can't actually have any physical contracts signed for however many days, but people can verbally agree to deals, and the Mavericks have been in an assortment of rumors the last few days, as you guys already, of course, know, sort of spearheaded, I guess, with the DeAndre Ayton rumor a couple days ago. And then, of course, the fact that Kyrie Irving is now considering taking meetings with other teams, most notably, as Chris Haynes reported of TNT, Kyrie Irving is apparently going to be with the Phoenix Suns at the start of free agency or somewhere around that time period. Of course, they do not have any cap space to sign him, but if they could, really pull through with some of the more insane cap gymnastics that we've seen in, recent history, that would probably have to involve some sort of, DeAndre Ayton sign and trade, that could always be applicable. And there's obviously been, an assortment of other rumors that we're going to get into today, but not just will we spin the rumor mill, we're also going to be covering literally almost any scenario the Mavericks could get into. Obviously last podcast, we got a little bit more in depth into specific guys that the Mavericks have been specifically rumored to target. And we'll still do that today, but this time we're going to really go over a whole overarching free agency big board, talk about all scenarios the Mavericks could, sort of sift through here, whether it's a guy, they could potentially only get with like the biannual exception, maybe just taking a flyer on a wing, up to, the potential DeAndre Ayton mega trade for Kyrie Irving or whatever you want to call it. So we'll be getting all into that today, of course. But before we do that, on this glorious June 30th day, to which the Mavericks' ultimate demise could be met here in a few hours, here's an ad from our sponsor, Spotify for Podcasters. All right, guys, so getting into it here, I got SpoTrack all pulled up, so we're just going to sift through essentially almost any free agent targets that are even on the market. We'll probably gloss over a lot of names that, I deem not applicable or, would be too expensive or just not realistic for the Mavericks. But we'll at least mention everyone, give them our due diligence, and, kind of look at different options for the Mavericks and how much we'd like them. We're kind of just going to go down the list here. But of course, before we get into everything, I do want to kind of just keep up with a little housekeeping stuff, some stuff that's kind of came around as far as Mavericks news goes throughout the last couple days. First off, and I didn't even mention this in the intros, chief malpractice by myself, I apologize, but per Mark Stein, as reported really kind of like last night, but even more prominently today, Dwight Powell is indeed expected to re-sign in Dallas. Now, a figure of that amount was not dished out, so we don't know if it's the veteran minimum, the biannual exception, if the Mavericks are able to retain that, or some other figure. I believe the Mavericks do indeed have Powell's bird rights, so that'll be interesting to see what that kind of ends up coming out to. Obviously, Dwight Powell has been a storied Maverick since 2014, a great servant of the community here in Dallas, a great role model, veteran locker room leader. There's a lot of inconsistencies with his actual basketball game that I think definitely, sort of sway fans the wrong way when you start, considering Dwight Powell and yet another contract that he may receive in Dallas. But my personal thoughts on the situation are that I honestly think for a veteran minimum, given the role Dwight, subsequently would play, it wouldn't really be a bad idea for him to re-sign in Dallas. Now, that being said, there have been reports, specifically from ESPN's Tim McMahon, along with just a few other sort of estimates as to how the season may end up turning out for the Mavericks from guys that are, fairly plugged in. I believe the tickets, Bob Stern, he tweeted something around the effect that he would not be surprised if the Mavericks had Powell as their starting center next year and he was getting 24 to 30 minutes a game. Things like that are definitely what concerned me, right? And, I get that the rebuilding process, and I don't even know if I really want to call it that. It was a retool for sure. That word just kind of slipped out of my mouth, given the constant NBA jargon that I take in on a daily basis. But just given that, I do think that for the Mavericks to delegate Dwight as the starting center in another year, he's going to turn 32 in July. I just think it would be chief malpractice from, a front office perspective to do that when you pushed all your chips in at the Kyrie Irving trade. I understand that, a full retool to contention isn't necessarily wildly unrealistic, but is something that is very hard to pull off, expecting the Mavericks to be able to be, true contenders after this offseason. It's not, just as simple as a snap or, clap your fingers. Clap your fingers. I don't even know why I said that. Clap your hands together and, boom, the team looks really good on paper. They've addressed all their issues. There's still a lot of other variables at play, and the Mavericks have to have a ton of depth if they do wish to, even be in the category of a contender, to be able to survive injuries, unaccounted variables that could happen throughout the season, guys not playing up to the level that we expect them, fit not going the right way. So there are a lot of added layers there in terms of, achieving the path of true contention. But I do think that that's something that the Mavericks have to shoot for at the very least. I don't think that it's something that they can, necessarily put by the wayside and be like, okay, we're kind of just retooling, getting a little bit younger, kind of doing what Memphis has done the last few years, where we're going to, accrue a few assets to build up, a potential package for a star player in a couple years. And then, really hit the nail on the head when we're able to cash in some of these younger role players and, then have that, holistically complete roster that is deep to an extent, at least at every position, or has enough stars and role players to at least subside some of the depth issues. But obviously, I just don't know if that is a path that they have the luxury to choose. They essentially gave up all their future draft assets that they can trade in the future at that Kyrie Irving trade. And I mean, they didn't have much to begin with, given the Kristaps Porzingis swap and, how stringent the Stepien rule is with their ability to not be able to trade picks in back-to-back years and stuff like that. But I mean, essentially all they have is that 2027 first round pick. And then I believe at some time over the course of the next season, or I guess July 1st, they'll be able to trade like a 2023 second, if I don't stand corrected. And then the next year, probably the 2031 first. But I mean, we're talking about picks that are, way into the future, first round picks that, yes, are coveted. They're not meaningless, but you definitely have to find the right team to, be willing to, play the waiting game for that long. A team that is, deep within the rebuilding stages, has a play that they're willing to consolidate over to the Mavericks. And that, always isn't an applicable scenario. But, barring just that, I do think that they have a sort of championship window to cash in here with Luka Doncic. We don't know if he's going to retain the same loyalty that Dirk did for, 21 seasons in Dallas. That's something very special. And that's something that cannot be expected in the modern day NBA, just because Luka loves and enjoys Dallas. He constantly, raves on his social medias about some of the things he gets to do here. He enjoys the city. He, is hashtag MFFL per se. He said that in a lot of his Instagram posts and things of that nature. But even that is just not convincing enough in the modern NBA, given the volatility of how stars can, flip on a dime, especially with, years after years of turmoil and, not making the, round that you want to in the playoffs or not getting far enough. I mean, we're seeing that sort of domino effect trickle down with Dame Lillard now where, he's sort of maybe not in the middle of his prime, but he's at the sort of midish end of his prime, in that kind of sweet spot, where he's probably got a couple really good more years before we start to see his game wane off a little bit. And I mean, in actuality, he is technically coming off a career season, but for a Trailblazer squad that, wasn't even able to scratch 500 or even close to it. They fared worse than the Mavericks. So we obviously don't want that's, our situation with our star player to get to that point where has discontent with the front office for, choosing to go younger, for instance, because they want to select a Scoot Henderson at number 3 instead of looking to trade that pick, despite Dame's overt loyalty to the Trailblazers. And I'm not saying that Luka, should just be penciled in to leave or that he's, a surefire candidate to be out of Dallas because of, the franchise not going in the specific direction he wants here in a couple of years or him not feeling like he has enough help. He does place heavy expectations on himself, expects a lot of it out of himself, and is not a guy that complains about roster management or anything like that. But years of losing can definitely take a toll on an individual, especially as uber competitive as, Doncic is. So it's something that the Mavericks can't screw around with as young and as much potential as this guy has at only 24, being the franchise cornerstone, hopefully for years to come. They have to try to be competitive every year unless push comes to shove and, Kyrie Irving leaves this summer and they can somehow convince Luka upon, retooling even heavier, getting a little bit younger, to really reach true contention in a couple years. With Kyrie Irving having made that move, with Kyrie Irving being 31, their push or chips, or their chips are pushed in to the absolute brim. And, if Kyrie Irving is to return, they are going to have to cash in on that contract. So with the Dwight Powell scenario, I just don't think defensively he gives you the best chance as a starter. Yes, he has been reliable when his number has been called upon, despite injuries and other sort of weird situations at the center spot that the Mavericks have had throughout multiple of the past seasons. He always steps up to the plate, is always a professional, is always ready, despite maybe even not getting playing time at the beginning of the season. But in a season like this, I just don't think, especially given the data that we can look back at with that 2022 playoff series and how Powell is a spot starter, really only playing maybe 20-ish minutes a game against the Warriors, subsequently was just played off the floor by Kevon Looney, was almost an albatross for the Mavericks defense at times with his lack of rim protection, the fact that he was getting out rebounded. Yes, Powell is a good offensive rebounder, but for whatever reason, he just doesn't positionally project to be the best rebounder on the court, even though he does have good size, good upper and lower body strength, as well as good positioning. Maybe a lack of verticality, a lack of length maybe adds to that. But he did get worked in that playoff series. And I just think that when we get to the higher levels of basketball, even if the Mavericks were to have, multiple splashy wing defenders, I think rim protection could be a huge suffering point. And obviously the rebounding and rim protection was probably one of the bigger points needing to be addressed at the trade deadline last year, and the Mavericks chose not to. They chose to kind of punt and see what they could do this summer, which is fine. But they have to cash in at this point, and all signs kind of point towards Dwight being the starting center. I don't know necessarily how I feel about that. If the Mavericks do end up making the Richaun Holmes trade official, and Derek Lively, Richaun Holmes, and Dwight Powell is the center rotation. Depending on how Powell or Holmes fare, I think the Mavericks can definitely get by in the regular season if they have the right surrounding wing defenders. They're able to really cash in on this MLE with some guys that we'll talk here about momentarily. Maybe even swing another trade with that 27 first round pick. There could be a lot of potential for this team, even if they do keep their current center rotation. But as far as contending goes, I do think that just given the rim pressure that a lot of these, true contenders have, non one-dimensional wings that can attack off a closeout, whenever they want, essentially, as well as, most of them when you look at, some of the best teams in the West, always having a spearhead sort of wing scorer or, point of attack ball handler that can get to the rim ad nauseum. I just do think that rim protection is just too quintessential to a team's being, to be something that is, a sore point of sorts. And I do think Derek Lively can come in and mend the issues. I don't think that he's ready to be the full-fledged starter for the whole year. I would hope that he could prove me wrong, but I mean, he is a rookie, and, there are some intricacies of his game that he still has to get down. I think Dwight Powell can help him with a lot of that stuff and be a great locker room mentor, get him good at some of the intangibles, some of the effort things that, could really be beneficial to Lively's game. And I honestly would love Dwight Powell back on a minimum contract, or even like the biannual exception, something less than $5 million per year. I think he can still be serviceable. He's been a cog in the community as well as on the court, but starting, I just can't get behind. I'm sorry for anybody in the Dwight Powell fan club out there. I love him as a player, as a guy, but if he's starting for the Mavericks next season, then they can still definitely be a playoff team. I just earnestly don't see the pathway to even being considered a contender unless the other moves they make around the margins are just so good. Like if they were bolstering, say, the wing defense of the Raptors, and they just simply didn't have a tried and true rim protector, but they still got, a little splash of rim protection with Lively off the bench. That's a little bit different of a story, but I don't know if they're going to be able to build up a full array of wings and, point of attack defenders as well to be able to do that just in one offseason. So there are some guys that we'll talk about that could, definitely be solutions to the rim protection situation. Will the Mavericks still consider that? I don't know. Mark Stein said that the Mavericks, of course, could resurface with a DeAndre Ayton, trade. So we're just going to have to kind of see how things culminate over the next 24 hours. If those talks end up, being discussed further after Phoenix initially shut them down, after the Mavericks' unwillingness to include JaVale McGee in a potential trade for DeAndre Ayton that would have featured JaVale McGee, Tim Hardaway Jr., and Rashawn Holmes for DeAndre Ayton. We'll have to see what comes out and how everything sort of evolves over the course in the next few hours, but also the next few days, because free agency, while the big wave of news will definitely likely come at the beginning, I do think that we will see a lot of rumors, a lot of news still come after that, July 1st, genesis of the free agency period. So we're going to have to monitor it going forward. But this Dwight Powell situation is something to be concerned about as a Mavs fan, in my opinion, and especially from my perspective. And to also kind of pitch back to yesterday, the Mavericks almost had, it appears, another center on their hands after Mark Stein has now reported that there seems to be a sort of comfortability with the current center rotation. He didn't say that exactly, but that's kind of what it seems like reading through the tea leaves. But Andre Drummond, who ironically was actually on Theo Penson's podcast, Title League podcast, almost whiffed on that one for a second a couple weeks ago, and they were talking between themselves, about how Dallas was, and Theo was gassing up Dallas to Andre, and Andre Drummond apparently is poised, at least in his mind, to want to become a Dallas Maverick. Now, it doesn't seem like that's going to be able to come into fruition, because I don't think Andre Drummond wanted to sign for the minimum. So yesterday, he shockingly exercised his player option to make around $3 million this next season, with the Bulls. Now, they can still definitely trade him, but, the pathway to doing that is probably one where the Mavericks would have to add more salary, to the deal, as well as Chicago, from both sides to make that work. I know the Mavericks have a little of, outstanding money to still absorb for a trade exception. I know it's around like $3-ish million, so I would have to run the numbers to see if Drummond fits into that. But I mean, I guess that could maybe be an option. But is that worth even taking that contract back at that point? I don't know. It almost seemed as if, had Drummond declined his player option, the Mavericks could have then claimed him off there for the minimum contract or something of that nature. But that doesn't seem like that's going to be a situation that comes into fruition per Mark Stein. He said in his Substack that that the pathway to that, despite that being, Drummond's preference, just seems, to be too erratic, a little bit too many moving parts there. So we'll see what happens with that situation. I know a lot of Mavericks fans were like blowing their heads off to start the day, almost myself included to an extent. The only thing I think that was really saving me from, going ballistic once I saw the Andre Drummond likely to become a Dallas Maverick report yesterday, was probably just a saving grace that they didn't guarantee him a starting spot like they did with JaVale McGee last year. And I didn't know if they still had other things in the tank or if they would consolidate other big men elsewhere. But I mean, the Mavericks still clearly do have a logjam at big man. They still have JaVale McGee, Rashawn Holmes, if the trade is made official, Derek Lively, Maxi Kleber, and, per reports, probably Dwight Powell. So that's going to be an interesting situation to monitor within itself, to see, if the Mavericks really go into training camp with 5 big men. I mean, I obviously it has been reported that they are trying to get off of JaVale McGee's contract. They don't necessarily, see him in their future. I maybe thought that, they would let Powell walk, and if they could find a deal for Maxi, maybe bring in a different big man, they would keep, JaVale as the tertiary sort of reserve big. Given he's been in a lot of Dallas Mavericks Instagram posts, has been like doing all these hoop camps and stuff, has been posted up in Mavericks gear still. But that obviously doesn't mean too much in the big picture of things, but it's fun to read into the tea leaves and see what sort of hints and clues could actually end up being credible at the end of the day. So I would expect JaVale McGee to get moved in some sort of capacity, whether that just be a salary dump. So the Mavericks have the flexibility to sign Kyrie Irving to a lucrative deal to where they can still retain their MLE as well, or they somehow pull off that DeAndre Ayton trade and involve a 4th team or something like that, or maybe the Suns have a new sort of gauge of Ayton's value and are just a little more willing and able to move on from him. But as of right now, it seems as if JaVale, if he is traded, would be in some sort of salary dump-esque type of move. I haven't heard anything as far as bigger rumors go, a trade that he would be involved in, barring what we heard reported by Stein with that DeAndre Ayton deal that obviously the framework sort of fell apart on. So obviously, JaVale definitely did not perform up to expectations after being guaranteed the Mavericks starting center spot last year, and suffered pretty heavily defensively, from his slow reaction, didn't really fit as seamlessly or as, savvy as a veteran center of his status who, we kind of thought, as athletic as he still is, even at, age 35 or whatever, could at least give you 15, 20 serviceable minutes along with Christian Wood. It just didn't end up happening. And Christian Wood, I think it goes without saying, but it's been reported by multiple Mavericks reporters and insiders that he is likely not coming back. He'll go somewhere in free agency, maybe Miami, some team that absorbs him into cap space, creates cap space for him, something like that. Maybe he gets the MLE from another team. I don't know exactly what his market value is, but needless to say, after, the whole front office, coach, Christian Wood disconnect between all 3 parties in that instance, as well as, the player profile that me and Jaron did maybe a month or so ago back when we were still hashing out our player profiles before the draft and before the offseason had really, kicked off, with gasoline and really got humming as it has the last few days. It just became, more, clearly evident that Christian would not return to Dallas, given some of the behaviors he's displayed on his social media, just as well as on, how unhappy he was with his role last year and how he played with the Mavericks last year and the inconsistent minute flow he sort of had with head coach Jason Kidd. We talked a lot more about that situation on that podcast and our thoughts about the Mavericks mismanagement of it, but it's not something we're going to be divulging into today. The Mavericks do have an opportunity to reconstruct their roster in a better way. I don't necessarily think that Christian Wood has to fit into those plans to do that. He's not a guy that I'm looking at, that's going to leave Dallas and go tear it up somewhere and we'll be regretting this. Now, he very well could do that, especially given our luck with lots of players that end up leaving the Mavericks. And I honestly wouldn't be surprised, but given the current status and the track record of his game, really since his career started, I do think that the Mavericks can find a better fit for them at that center position. So not too much of a pressing matter, but that was the sort of housekeeping I kind of wanted to get into. Lastly, before we do get into all these names and stuff, we do have to do our due diligence with this Kyrie Irving situation, where all of a sudden, after being reported by Adrian Wojnarowski that he was essentially almost slated to come back to the Mavericks with not, a real market out there for him, it appears with that Kyrie and his camp are trying to create a market. Now, the Mavericks traded for Kyrie. If he is to leave, then nobody is to blame but them. I'm not blaming Kyrie for leaving the Mavericks. Now, it would suck, and I would be obviously very angry. It would be a very somber affair on the Mainstream Mavs podcast tomorrow if, Kyrie Irving is in heavy talks to somehow, will his way to Phoenix and some sort of, absolutely crazily structured 3-team sign and trade with DeAndre Ayton going to Dallas, or somehow Kyrie goes to Philly or something of that nature. But, I would say that I'm operating on the, sort of cautious optimistic side right now. Adrian Wojnarowski, along with many others, have still said that Kyrie, is likely to return to Dallas, and that the market for other teams out there is just kind of hard to find. And whatever contract he gets, Kyrie would kind of like for this to be where he plays out the rest of his career. So I would assume it would be a bigger contract, somewhere where, he's probably going to be like 34, 35 at the end of it, a potential 3-4 year, pretty lucrative deal here. Now it has been reported that the Mavericks are going to try and not necessarily lowball Kyrie, but they're going to try to get him on the best figure. Not trying to potentially pay him max money if the market doesn't necessarily command that, because there are not a lot of free agent suitors as of right now that have the cap space to sign correctly, to sign Kyrie Irving outright, especially the Phoenix Suns, the only, real potential suitor that has had or that is getting a meeting with Kyrie as far as we know. Now, there have been like things tossed out, mainly just kind of fanfare in terms of maybe Kyrie getting trade in a sign and trade, going to Philly or Miami, but I'm not reading too much into those because there's not really too many credence to any of those rumors. But the whole Phoenix Suns situation is crazy, and they'd obviously have to send back DeAndre Ayton and something like that. And I don't know necessarily if the Suns even have the wherewithal to, pull that off after trading for Bradley Beal, having almost, depending on how Ayton's playing, potentially 4 All-Stars on a roster. But Kyrie may be trying to drive up a market. We may see teams try to get tricky with the cap space, sort of tactics that they deploy over the next few hours with trades and stuff. So, I mean, we got to stay tuned. As surefire as it may have seemed like 48 hours ago, you never know with this type of stuff. I'm confident in Nico's ability, given what he was able to do on draft night. But obviously the Mavericks are still suffering from PTSD wounds from that Jalen Brunson situation last year. So I'm on the edge of my seat waiting to see exactly what happens, because this could make or break the offseason. This could also make or break, other potential players that are considering coming to Dallas, like maybe a Bruce Brown who played with Kyrie Irving in Brooklyn. Maybe that's the deciding factor between him and in LA. I mean, while it is heavily rumored that he would probably, re-sign in Denver, run it back with them, or go to like the Lakers or something like that, or even the Pacers, who have created an abundance of cap space over the last maybe, I don't know, like 12 hours. There are certain swing factors when you have a guy like Nico Harrison, and especially a dynamic, personality like Kyrie Irving, whose game is admired by lots of young players throughout the league. He's very revered, from a woke perspective by a lot of guys, even if, people in the NBA media don't necessarily agree with some of his viewpoints. I'm not really talking about myself, but, a lot of others. So there's a lot of layers of complexity there with Kyrie either leaving or not. And with him taking other free agent meetings, that's enough to get me worried, right? I'm not saying that I'm not still cautiously optimistic he'll re-sign, but I'd be lying to say that there's hesitancy until, pen is brought to paper. So that's going to be huge. And seeing how that situation evolves after it almost seemed kind of surefire over maybe the last 72 hours that him and the Mavericks could come to terms on a deal is going to be fascinating, especially if the Mavericks can tie him down on a more favorable figure, maybe like a 4 for 160 type of contract or something slightly above that. Maybe not the max where they would be essentially almost paying him 60 million if they structured that deal to be ascending as the salary cap with the TV deals and stuff rise year after year. Kyrie could make almost 60 million in the last year of a potential max contract. I don't know if the Mavericks are ready to commit to that, especially as old as he might be at the end of that contract, but something near that, I think I would definitely be keen to and would be applicable. But if the last option is to tie him down with that max contract, I just don't think, given the sign and trades out there, unless the Mavericks could really pull something nifty off, something that, we'd be leaving the fact, calling Nico Harrison one of the more god tier GMs in recent history. I just don't think the Mavericks can play with their food too heavily. Yes, try and wheel and deal, negotiate a little bit, but the second that there's any inclination that Kyrie does have a market from other teams, the Mavericks can offer him the most money. They need to swoop in, tell him, why the culture in Dallas can be something where he could play out the rest of his career, where he, whatever he wants to do off the court can be a sort of separate entity from basketball. And the Mavericks, will work with him on the things he wants to do, but we'll also support him on his endeavors on the basketball court. That's going to be an interesting sort of dynamic that they have to balance. And like I said, it will be a very fascinating development, but it is essential that they get Kyrie Irving this offseason. So at this point, with all the rumors coming out, as cautiously optimistic as I am, and as much as most of the signs point towards Kyrie re-signing in Dallas, they traded for him, and if he is to leave, he's not to blame. And I just am definitely on the edge of my seat in anticipation to see how this ends up going. But without further ado, after an extremely long sort of housekeeping segment of the podcast, let's go ahead and get into these guys, all the free agents the Mavericks could look into to adding. We'll also talk about DeAndre Ayton a little bit probably at the end of the podcast, given we just did one on him, but those rumors have obviously kind of took a back seat to some of the things that have came out in recent days. We'll be going through these guys by position to divvy it up a little easier, make it a little easier to sift through these guys, because there's a pretty huge conglomerate of guys on this Spotrac list right here that I'm looking at, a lot of which it kind of gives me a bit of epilepsy just looking at the big names, but once we categorize this list here, it's a lot easier to sort of look through. So looking at some of the free agent guards, this is obviously probably the least sort of position of need for the Mavericks, but they could still definitely use a sort of point of attack, defender that can guard ones, twos, and, even guard up on threes a little bit, i.e. a Bruce Brown, who has been, most heavily rumored out of some of these guys. Obviously, the Mavericks don't necessarily need a tried and true point guard unless Kyrie Irving does leave that vacancy for them and they're not able to get back another point guard alongside Luka in a trade. Then this becomes a, even, more amplified spot of need for the Mavericks. So I do think it's important to do our due diligence and look through all potential options. But, without further ado, let's get into this list. Obviously, Kyrie Irving is a free agent. That goes without saying. Russell Westbrook is a free agent. Given some of the sort of comments Mark Cuban has made in the past, I don't know necessarily how applicable that would be, especially with, I think, a guy like Westbrook is definitely going to try to settle somewhere for maybe half of the MLB, the MLE, or maybe like the MLE, try to ride it out with, a pretty big star-studded team, something like that. I've seen some reports that he's kind of waiting to see what's going to happen. So we'll see what happens there. But I don't think the Mavericks would bring him alongside Luka as a starter if Kyrie were to leave, nor do I think that they would bring him off the bench. But, I mean, you do never know. If the Mavericks have everything sorted out in free agency and the wing depth is at a premium, they get a sort of, they get their stopgap starting rim protector like we've all wanted, that they may be punting on in favor of Dwight Powell in their current center rotation, then hey, I'm open to adding a point guard to come off the bench like a Russell Westbrook. But other things need to be solved first, and that goes for a lot of these guys, I would say. D'Angelo Russell, he's a little bit harder. I just don't think the Mavericks are going to have the money to be able to finagle him. He's in the camp with a couple other guys that I'll mention here momentarily that, if there's still a market out there for him, if he hasn't already been claimed, if he doesn't, re-sign with the Lakers like he seems pretty poised to do after having just recently been traded there, then yeah, sure, maybe he could sign with the Mavericks if somehow Kyrie Irving just signs outright into cap space somewhere, and the Mavericks now have an abundance of cap space, almost, basically a max slot waiting for them to be able to just throw at any of these guys. But as of right now, I don't see that, being a situation that would come into fruition. Same sort of deal with Fred VanVleet. He's heavily rumored to go to Houston, unless, Kyrie leaves and goes somewhere to like Houston, where they just have an abundance of cap space. It's not a sign and trade where the Mavericks are taking any salary back. I just don't see that. Or even if it is a sign and trade, I know that the whole like 50% rule in terms of, the team sending out the salary or taking it back in. I'm a little bit confused as to the exact intricacies of that. I need to touch up on my CBA knowledge a little bit. I'm pretty sure that that's still the same in the second CBA, but I do have a little bit of hesitancy. So I want to reserve more of my sign and trade sort of theorems here, or potential deals as, in the hypothesis category. I'm not here to, give you an exact deal that I made up in the trade machine, via sign and trade that is for sure going to work. More so just talking about names and stuff, because it can be very convoluted this time of year with how hard some of those sign and trades are to pull off and stuff. But, conversely, it also is the easiest part of the year to pull off a sign and trade. So there is that as well. Eric Gordon is, one of the, he is 34.5, but he's still a very serviceable point of attack defender that can guard up a little bit when he's sort of asked to. Will be a kind of, strict sort of 3-and-D dude that can handle the ball a little bit. I think he'd probably come off for the bench, for the Mavericks. I could see him. I could see the Mavericks after Eric Gordon declined his player option of almost $19 million. I could see the Mavericks making a play for him. Maybe he wants to secure a longer term deal with a little bit less money, given his age. That is a situation I could see. I was surprised when he declined his player option yesterday with the Clippers. So we'll see how that turns out. I haven't seen any rumors about him in Dallas, but definitely at least a name to monitor. Speaking of player options, we forgot to mention it specifically in the podcast because I did kind of feel like it was a foregone conclusion. But Reggie Bullock did indeed end up picking up his or the Mavericks ended up picking up rather Reggie Bullock's team option. I think it's just a smarter play to, be able to involve him at a $10 million salary figure for trades and what have you. I just think he is a little too good, even despite, some of the negatives that I harped on heavily with him last season, to be a guy that gets stretched waived, and unless it's, really the only sort of applicable avenue for the Mavericks to go to create space to sign Kyrie after the fact. I think they could do so. They could easily stretch waive JaVale McGee if it really came to that. So I'm not too pressed on the Reggie Bullock front. He could still definitely be on the move via trade or something of that nature if the Mavericks were to get a favorable scenario. But no surprises there, in my opinion. If they did end up waiving that option and having a little bit more cap space, that would have been interesting. But I don't know how easy it would have been also to have found a surefire wing replacement with that remaining cap around $10 million. Just not a lot of guys sort of in that range. And look, I'm not even saying Reggie should be a starter next year, and I would hope that the Mavericks can address that wing position throughout the next month or so to where he doesn't become a starter next year. But I still think that they can consolidate him elsewhere in a trade and get a little bit more value whether it's getting a pick, maybe a second round pick, or, even, just getting, taking back maybe a negative asset for him that they want to take a flyer on, something like that. I just think there's more useful ways. So glad they did that. But continuing with the list, Karis LeVert from Cleveland. I mean, shot in the dark at the Mavericks address all their problems. That they may still be looking for some tertiary ball handling. Could look at a Karis LeVert to come off, be that coveted backup point guard. But I mean, I think, given his lack of defensive presence, even and just the fact that he's not near as good as even some of the other guys we mentioned so far, maybe Russell Westbrook and him have a sort of contender if you're picking who's the better player head to head at this stage in their, both of their respective careers. But I don't really see Karis LeVert as a guy that would be coming to Dallas. I know there were some rumors last year that surfaced. Obviously, all this is dependent on what the Mavericks end up doing. Now, if they trade Tim Hardaway Jr., that leaves a sort of vacancy from a scoring perspective that you kind of have to fill. Things like this could be applicable, and maybe Karis LeVert, ends up coming on part of the MLE to Dallas or something like that. But as currently stands, maybe he's a full MLE guy, but he did have a pretty bad season last year, so we'll see. But as things currently stand, I don't see anything really getting done there. I think Malik Beasley will probably end up signing a longer-term deal with the Lakers, but it'll be interesting to monitor. I don't think that it is a surefire thing. He did opt out of that player option of $15 million, so he may even want more money. A decent defender, in terms of being able to go ones and twos, definitely not, a complete ball stopper. He's not like a Bruce Brown or anything like that, but he's no slouch, and he's a pretty good volume 3-point shooter. He's had sort of a down year or so ever since, he kind of left Minnesota, but I do think he can get back closer to that 40% mark, especially in a system where he's playing maybe with Luka and Kyrie. I could see him a little bit more realistically if the Mavericks are able to, address some of their other issues, but I do think that they will prioritize other things before him. So like I said, if they are able to address some of their other issues, and this really does end up turning out to be the perfect offseason, I could see them circling back to him at the end if he's still available. But all kind of signs point towards him joining the Lakers still. Derrick Rose, good backup point guard at the Mavericks, are still looking for a little bit of tertiary ball handling. I could definitely see him being an option on a veteran minimum or something like that. Maybe just a biannual exception if they are able to retain that, given this, certain cap logistics they kind of have to work around. That'd be interesting. I think he'd be a good mentor to some young guards, and a lot of guys would look up to him. I think that he'd have, be a very good locker room vet, would provide a lot of good experience. He's actually not as old as I thought. He's about to turn 35, but he's still, just about 34. He's a guy that later in free agency I could see the Mavericks circling back to, but definitely not a day one name to come off the board. Will Barton, he's a sort of 2/3 that was one of the more, sort of non-one-dimensional good defensive point of attack defenders in recent history, almost comparable to like a Bruce Brown a few years ago, but age has started to catch his number a little bit. His shooting isn't as good as as it once was. His defense is a little less proficient, a little less dynamic. He maybe have lost a step. He definitely hasn't, had the best last couple seasons. He just got traded to the Raptors, I believe, at the deadline after being on the Wizards, if I recall, or maybe he was even before that. But, like I said, another guy that maybe the Mavericks circle back to at the end of free agency to throw the biannual exception at or something like that. But I don't think he's getting, big money from the Mavericks. I think that they need wings more, decent point of attack, defender, but he's not shifting the trajectory of the Mavericks. Josh Richardson, a guy that we all know and love. He's also kind of in that category of guys Mavericks can maybe circle back to at a certain juncture of free agency, but he is a guy that played fairly well for New Orleans. He's about to be 30. I think he could be a decent point of attack defender off the bench. I don't think he'd solve that issue completely. He's, he has kind of improved a little bit defensively from his time in Dallas. I don't know necessarily if that's a schematic thing. Him being able to kind of freelance, use his length to disrupt off ball a little bit more, not getting bodied as much on ball. He's not as good of an on ball defender as some other guys, but he's definitely no slouch. He'd be interesting, especially as his 3-point numbers have been a little bit more consistent since his time here. But, anytime you're bringing guys back, there's also another sort of, added layer of complexity there. But this is the new regime. So, guys like him, or a Seth Curry, who's about to turn 33. I could definitely see the Mavericks making a play for if somehow they're able to pull off, those higher positions of needs like a wing or a rim protector. But I don't know if either one of those guys are worth throwing real money at over things that the Mavericks need to address more heavily. Bruce Brown Jr., obviously a guy that has been in the rumor mill for the Mavericks, has been, at first reported to be, I believe, by that NBA anonymous account that has been right a few times that everybody's kind of going ballistic about on Twitter. At first, was reported to either be considering signing with the Los Angeles Lakers or the Dallas Mavericks once free agency opens. And I mean, this guy, as much as the Mavericks don't need a point of attack ball defender comparable to how much they need a wing and a center, not saying they don't need it, but it's just not as, essential to address. But I mean, this guy is one of the best in the league at that. He can guard up a little. He can be delegated to do some playmaking duties. He would probably be, the third playmaker on the team for sure. He's even better, I'd say it, than probably Jaden Hardy at that. Definitely, not going to see as much shot creation from him, but he's dynamic in terms of his ability to get to the rim. Is not a bad finisher. Shot well from three. Is bringing a championship pedigree. I mean, there's just too many positives now. With some of the spaces being opened up, especially by Indiana, is seeming less and less likely like Brown would consider the Mavericks. Given that he only made the taxpayer MLE last year, and this was a career season. He's about to turn 27 here soon. He's only 26 right now. Is poised to be one of the better role players in the NBA for the next couple of years. I think he might be trying to cash in on a bigger deal, but I would love for him to come. I mean, I would definitely not be opposed by any stretch of the imagination. That would be one of the more hype free agent signings, in my opinion, especially if the Mavericks are able to get another wing or two, like a Taurean Prince or somebody like that. Maybe get a stopgap starting center. I know that cliche stopgap term has been used ad nauseum over the last 72 hours, but I'm just kind of rolling with the Mavs Twitter wave, and I'm going to continue to use it because nobody can get it out of their mouth. So I apologize to anybody that's annoyed by it, but it is what it is. But yeah, I mean, Bruce Brown would be the dude for me in Dallas with that MLE. If the Mavericks were somehow able to pull that off, he wants to come play with Kyrie again. He has a good relationship with Nico by chance. Bring Bruce Brown as well as Lena Rhodes and their kid to Dallas. I'm ready for all the hype. They can start a reality TV show. I will personally fund it. Lamar Odom 2.0 situation, but hopefully, Bruce Brown is poised enough to not go down the same path as Lamar Odom, but prayers to Lamar Odom. And I'm glad that he's doing a lot well, a lot better as of right now. That was not, meant to be any sort of knock at him or his career. He's a great basketball player, and I'm really happy he's on the path to recovery. But obviously, I was more so making that joke from the standpoint that, once he did leave Dallas after, splitting up with Chloe, I believe it was, things definitely took a turn for the worse for him. So hopefully Bruce Brown would be a guy that stayed in Dallas, and thus, his lucky sort of charm actually ended up panning out for him. And he stayed on the right trajectory despite dating Lena Rhodes. Maybe they get married even. I think that would honestly be, the ultimate wedding. We would have to bring a full coverage of mainstream Mavs reporters to get at that, because that would be an event that we couldn't miss, just given not just the basketball history there, but the other history there. I would definitely have to congratulate Bruce Brown for that. But yeah, easily probably like my 1A guy that I want as far as guys that have been listed as realistic targets for the Mavericks or have actually been in the rumor mill. If he somehow signs here, you will see one happy camper on the Mainstream Mavs podcast. Another guy that has sort of been, increasing in favoritism for me is Dante DiVincenzo, who recently declined his, option with Golden State. I mean, look, this is a good 3-and-D wing, good shooter. He's able to create off the dribble for himself a little bit, pretty uber athletic. I thought he may have been a little bit younger, but he just turned 26, so he'll be 26 basically throughout the entire season. I love his fit here. Now, I don't know what exactly his market is. It's rumored to, be anywhere from like 6 to 12 million, but potentially even higher. So for the right price, especially if we get out another wing, I'd love this dude. But, if he's even commanding more off the block, I wouldn't have a problem giving the full MLE to him. We haven't really seen him in a full starting level role on a consistent basis. But when we have, he's honestly done pretty well. So I would not be opposed to that. Lonnie Walker the fourth, I think he'll probably end up staying in LA, but he has a lot of promise as a point of attack defender and can guard up a little more than some of the guys on this list. Him and DiVincenzo, for that matter, kind of project more as lengthier, sort of lean bodied kind of wings, comparable to a guard label for them. So either of those guys I'd be definitely interested in for the right price, but they're definitely not guys I think the Mavericks should overextend themselves on. I would, if they're overpaying them, then that's going to give me a little hesitancy. Hamidou Diallo, a guy that I would definitely like to look out for. He has a lot of promise, but there's just, he's almost 25, and, while as good as he is on defense, as athletic as he is, he definitely wouldn't be a starter. Would be a guy that would be a solid rotation piece off the bench, but still a lot of things he needs to prove in his game. But I'd be interested to take a flyer on him for the right price. Same kind of thing with Kobe White, who's only 23, but he does project more as that sort of tertiary ball handler. As keen as I was to getting him last year when that was more of a position of need for the Mavericks, I think the Mavericks would have to address a few other things before, I'm really knocking at the door for Kobe White. He is also a restricted free agent. I do think that the Bulls might be poised to, find something else for him, let him walk, maybe do a sign and trade, given the sort of logjam they have there at point guard. But with Lonzo Ball probably going to miss yet another season, it may change the sort of impetus around the Chicago front office, and they may end up wanting to keep Kobe White for that perspective. So, I don't have too much more on that. Terrence Davis is another guy that I think could be applicable. Was a solid sort of point of attack, guy that could defend ones and twos decent for Sacramento. Knocked in the three ball at a really high clip, but didn't get the most amount of minutes on that Kings rotation. He was a little inconsistent at times, but he lit up the Mavericks a couple times. I'd be interested in him for the right price for sure. Other guys on this list, they're good, but they've just kind of either had too many injuries, or maybe just a little too old, or they just don't solve enough issues defensively for what I'm looking for. Romeo Langford's a bigger guy. I'd be interested definitely taking a flyer on, but I'm not handing him a huge bag or anything like that. But I mean, other guys, like just a lot of veterans that have either been injury riddled or kind of provide just a different toolbox, or or more kind of filler guys at the end of the roster. Kendrick Nunn, I just don't know if he provides enough defensively to really be under the roof of consideration for the Mavericks, unless it's like August and they're filling out the back half of their roster. Corey Joseph, Ish Smith, even though he did get a ring, shout out to Ish Smith. George Hill. Nickeil Alexander-Walker is a guy that I think the Timberwolves are probably going to make a pretty good effort to re-sign, but I mean, if he's available for the right price, I definitely like him. I also see Matisse Thybulle getting re-signed by Portland. They have, he's a restricted free agent. They have his bird rights. So, he is 26. He'd be very interesting to try to take a flyer on, especially because of the lack of shooting. His value is depreciated quite a bit over the last couple of years, but, I'm definitely not saying no to Matisse Thybulle as a backup wing. As splashy of a defensive prospect he is, if his offensive game could even evolve even somewhat, I mean, that's a pretty good player that you're looking at there. Wesley Matthews, Austin Rivers, Dennis Schroeder, I think will probably return to the Lakers regardless. Dilla Vadova, Raul Neto, Roddy Magruder, Javon Carter. That's a guy that I'd maybe look at. Dennis Smith Jr. is another free agent. He's only 25. Him and Javon Carter, two sort of more defensive-minded guys that I think are definitely worth taking into consideration for sure. Now, when you're filling out the back half of the roster, especially if there still is a little bit of positional need for a point guard there, maybe Mike Miles Jr. or Jordan Walker don't fare how you want them to in summer league. I could see that being applicable. Damian Lee, surprisingly, is almost 31. I did not think he came into the league that early, but that is interesting. Troy Brown Jr. A lot of like wings, Aaron Holiday, Josh Okogie, a lot of guys that sort of have that one-dimensionality aspect to their game, but would definitely be interesting to add, to see if they can develop at all, especially like a Troy Brown Jr. is only almost 24. He's still, barely 23. There's a lot of guys at the Mavericks I'd love to take flyers on in that range, but not a lot of guys, in terms of being a point of attack, ball defender, that I'm comfortable, handing significant money to over higher positions of needs for the Mavericks. But in terms of guys that they could fill out with the rest of their money, I mean, we're looking at some decent options here. Svi Mikhailuk, good shooter, decent defender. Frank's listed here. I don't know if he'll come back, but it's those moves around the margins, like replacing a Justin Holiday, replacing a Frank, where I could see the Mavs taking some flyers on some of these guys. Maybe they're not going to get significant playing time, but I mean, it's worth a shot, right? So that'll be interesting, but I don't think really a lot of these guys are out of play for the Mavericks. I just think that there are more, important issues on the forefront. Gabe Vincent's really interesting. He's maybe only 6'2", but he's a very good system point guard. Like I said, I don't think that that's a direction the Mavericks would necessarily be too attuned to unless Kyrie is out, or they've got everything sort of filled out. But that's interesting. Javonte Green is a really good defender and has kind of been buried in the Bulls rotation. I'd be interested in him. Max Strus, obviously, he's a starting level wing. Despite his, wingspan and everything, he's a pretty good defensive guy. He's only 27, just turned 27, a little younger than I thought. Really good shooter. Definitely would not be opposed to him. I just don't know exactly what his price range is, or if the Mavericks are going to be there. Shake Milton, I could see maybe at the tail end once things are figured out, coming back to Dallas, having been an SMU guy. Mavericks selected him in the draft, as a matter of fact, but then shortly traded him to Philadelphia, I believe, for like Costas a few years ago. So that'd be interesting. Ayo Sumo, Trey Jones, 2 restricted free agent, younger guys, haven't been in the league too long. And I think both teams would match really any realistic offer sheet. Austin Reeves, I think the Lakers are kind of poised to do that as well. Obviously, like I mentioned, Justin Holiday and Frank are still options, but I'd hope the Mavericks kind of try to improve around the margins a little bit more with some of these moves. David Duke Jr., maybe a guy I could see the Mavericks looking at, kind of a promising sort of young player for the Nets last year, but they do have his early bird rights. He's a restricted free agent, so we'll see there. Saban Lee. I mean, there's really not a whole lot of guards, point of attack defenders. We could always bring McKinley right back to, maybe a Ty Jerome. Teo Maledon's an interesting guy, but he's a restricted free agent. It'll be interesting. Dwayne Washington Jr., a guy we always talk about, Jared Butler. There's a lot of different dudes at the end of this list that are definitely, under the umbrella of consideration, but should not be prioritized as, the main sort of dudes for the Mavericks. So we'll just see how that kind of goes out. But those are all the guards I think the Mavericks would definitely be worth considering. Let's go ahead and, without further ado, divulge into these forwards. Chris Middleton, I think I expect to re-sign with Milwaukee, same as Draymond Green. Now, obviously, those would be dream scenarios, but it just doesn't seem like we're going to have the wherewithal or money to pull that off, nor did I expect us to. Jeremy Grant, I think he definitely probably returns to Portland, but if their situation does go haywire and the sort of feeling around trading Dame is an increasing notion all of a sudden, then I mean, definitely, look out for that. But the Mavericks would have to, probably facilitate a sign and trade. It would be a sticky scenario. He definitely is not just going for the full MLE. So I don't know exactly how they would pull that off, but it's interesting to monitor. Kyle Kuzma is a guy that's definitely going to command more than the Mavericks are willing to pay. But I mean, there were some sprinkles of sort of interest there. I would love him in Dallas. I mean, he's a decent defender, but I mean, he's one of the more non-one-dimensional wings. Is almost a 3-level scorer to an extent in terms of the way he played in Washington. Will be 28 for all of next year. I would not be opposed to it at all, but I mean, it would have to be the right scenario. I don't even know if Kyrie could necessarily come back and that still be facilitated. So a guy to, keep an eye on, but definitely not a guy that's likely to end up in Dallas when he has other teams probably willing to throw him a bigger bag. Kelly Oubre Jr. is a guy that, has not broke some of the tendencies that have sort of obstructed him from becoming, really coming into his true potential. But I mean, he is a decent starter level wing that, is long and plays decent defense. If he could figure it out, he's 27 and a half at this stage in his career. Maybe there's a sort of maturation that's gone on there in terms of accepting his place as a role player. I'd look at him. I think he could go maybe for definitely less than MLE money, but we'll see what the market is for him. He's an interesting personality too, but he's not the first guy I'd like, despite all the I guess issues, with some of the things he says to the media and things like that. I think Dillon Brooks would be an interesting option for the Mavericks at that MLE number. Now, it does seem as if he's kind of poised to go elsewhere, but definitely not a guy the Mavericks can neglect. I think he would, boast a lot of value to our roster as a 3-and-D dude. But there are better guys, better options. But if we were to, do multiple wings, go that route, bring in Dillon Brooks and maybe another wing, then I'd be a lot more keen to that. But if he's the sole MLE signing, definitely maybe going to be scratching my head a little bit. Jay Crowder on a cheaper deal, given he's 33. And I, have not been too impressed with his, how the last season sort of ended up panning out with him, after he demanded that trade, essentially went to Milwaukee for almost like 5 second-round picks and then didn't play. I mean, I'd be interested, especially to add a veteran wing, especially if you're adding him in aggregate with another wing this free agency. But like I said, he's not the guy that you're throwing all the money at with the MLE here. Maybe the biannual exception would be a little bit more applicable with the Mavericks end up retaining that. I don't think the Mavericks are going to be looking at Dario Saric. Taurean Prince, I could definitely see the Mavericks pull the trigger on for the right price after Minnesota declined his team option. Hopefully not the full MLE, but I mean, to add a surefire, 29-year-old veteran wing, good 3-and-D guy. He's a little one-dimensional, but to shore up the wing rotation a little bit, especially if the Mavericks got one or two other guys, I'd love him here. Rui Hachimura, I think, is re-signing in LA. Joe Ingles probably going to re-sign with the Bucks, or maybe on another contender, but he's the sort of fringe dude that I just don't think the Mavericks are in play for, given he's one of those guys that you almost kind of view as not a ring chaser, but a guy at this stage, after having been shipped off the Jazz, is definitely kind of just looking to contribute to winning basketball, and maybe not a guy that views the Maverick situation as the most surefire instance to be able to do that for sure. So I don't know about him. Torrey Craig, I mean, on a very cheap deal, I'd like to be a veteran wing, but other things, have to be taken into account first. Cam Reddish would be good prospective flyer to take on, and I would really be interested in his fit with the Mavericks, despite the wildly inconsistent career he'd have. It'd be funny to see how the Mavericks would ultimately, at that point, end up getting the number 10th pick that they ended up trading to Atlanta to move up to get Luka in exchange for Trae Young in the subsequent following year of 2019. That ended up becoming Cam Reddish. He's very dynamic in terms of his ability to get to the rim. Is a very skilled player. It's just the consistency with him and putting in consistent defensive effort. So I would like to monitor that, but like I said, not the leader in the clubhouse in terms of guys that you're handing the full MLE money to over a guy like a Bruce Brown, for instance, right? Jeff Green, I mean, I think he's probably poised to return to the Nuggets, just given his age and the fact that they just won a championship. But look, I mean, if he's willing to come here, I think his championship experience would be invaluable. I still think he has a lot of juice to his game. He's a good defensive player, really good cutter, pretty good shooter, could add a lot to this team off the bench for the right price. But I don't know if he'd be willing to come here. I don't even know if I want to talk about Miles Bridges. He is a restricted free agent, but I mean, I haven't even really heard much on the front of exactly what his market is or anything like that, if he even is going to be playing next year. So, I mean, if we see more details about the investigation with him and his legal troubles coming to fruition, then I mean, sure. But until then, I'm definitely putting him on standby, and he's not going to be under the umbrella of consideration for me, at least. Justice Winslow is an interesting sort of, taller ball handler that, projects well defensively, but has, obviously suffered throughout his career and not really reached his potential because of his lack of a jump shot. But at the tail end of a rotation, he is only 27. Why not take a shot on him? Georges Niang, Derek Jones Jr., two other guys that, add completely different skill sets. One, in Derek Jones Jr. being really athletic, good defender. Niang being a surefire sort of 3-point guy, not necessarily the typical 3-and-D prolific sort of archetype, but he is a guy that is a good team defender, has a high basketball IQ, so he's not just a complete L on defense. I consider both of those guys for the right price, but you're not throwing the bag at them. PJ Washington will be a restricted free agent. I would love him. I mean, I think that he could solve a ton of issues for the Mavericks. He's only almost 25. He'd be great to add to the young core. I just don't think that they're going to have the money to get him, especially with Charlotte's ability to match whatever offer sheet's there. Kevin Knox, I'm just not really too high on. He hasn't really showed much promise to me in his 5 seasons in the league, but I mean, sure, if he gets a training camp invite or they take a flyer on him after free agency's there. I mean, obviously Grant Williams would be a great guy with the MLE, but I'm seeing a growing sort of sense that he's going to return to Boston. The Mavericks were obviously in rumors with him. I would love Grant Williams in Dallas again, like PJ Washington. I think he would solve a ton of issues. He's only 24, not even going to turn 25 for about another half year. He'd be a dream fit scenario, would probably start day one, but can cover up a lot of defensive lapses, both on the wing and a little bit from not necessarily maybe a rim protection standpoint but from his ability to guard up a little bit with his size. He'd be a dream fit, but I just don't know if he'd be if that's actually going to come into fruition as free agency gets closer and closer. Darius Baisley is a guy maybe worth taking a flyer on. He's only 23, just turned 23. He's a lot younger than people think. I mean, he came into the league at 18? I can't remember what the situation was. I don't think he played in college though. So I mean, I'd consider him, but he's definitely not, worthy of throwing more than a few million at or something like that. JaMychal Green, really good role player, really good backup wing. Even though he's 33, I would love his fit here. In the same vein as I kind of talked about Jeff Green, he just is that sort of savvy veteran wing with really good size, can play a little small ball 5, can defend 3s and 4s really well. He's obviously going to have some switchability issues when tasked with guarding smaller guards, but he's a lot more athletic than people think. I noticed from a few games last year, so I'd love him at the back half of the rotation for the right price. But I do think the Mavericks need to prioritize, finding a guy to sign with the MLE that's worth it before they do that. Trey Lyles, I mean, this is a guy that, is a decent weak side rim protector, also a really good, sort of guy that can stretch the floor on offense. He's like 6'10", 6'11", but can also is fairly quick footed, is not a terrible guy in terms of being able to defend 3s and 4s. I would like him for, especially I don't think he'll command full MLE money. He kind of just sort of revitalized his career in Sacramento. I do think he's probably poised to return there on a decent deal, but I would not hate his fit whatsoever. I'd be very keen to it. In fact, not Jaden McDaniels, but Jalen McDaniels. Definitely one of the guys in terms of the flyer category that I would be most keen to adding to the Mavericks. He's only 25, not as holistic and complete of a game as his brother, in terms of being, a really dynamic wing that can, that has that ability to attack off the closeout, get to the rim, and score at a moment's notice. We talk a lot about Omax or new Maverick, Olivier Maxence Prosper, who kind of has that sort of toolbox that we think one day could maybe evolve into a Jaden McDaniels from the Timberwolves. But his older brother and Jalen off the Sixers really didn't play as much for them. He was at the back half of their rotation in the playoffs, but I do think if he adds a little size, I still think he could, given he's only 25. I still think there is a little room for development there. He projects to be, a really good role player, could just be as good as his brother if he's able to tune up and, sort of fine tune some of the intricacies of his game. But, I'm not throwing the full MLE at him. He hasn't proved that much to me, especially given he's not, the most young guy on the planet, but for the right price, maybe 5-6 million, if you want to consolidate and divvy up the MLE into 2 or 3 different guys, I think I would really like him, especially if the Mavericks, lose out on like a Kyrie and, God forbid, of course, but they have to go a little bit younger, or if the Mavericks just, end up going younger, even if I don't necessarily agree with it, I would at least like them to get a few young guys to at least have promise. If that's the scenario, the direction that they pick to choose, I would at least like them to go full-fledged in that direction, sort of operate instead of, just kind of operating on the fringes of mediocrity like they kind of have. Other guys on this list, there's not too many guys that, I'd be more keen to, to adding and giving up more than, a few million or just taking a flyer on them. But I'll definitely mention a few names. O'Shea Brissett would be an interesting sort of, big that can guard down a little bit, but is also a decent rim protector, really active. Rick Carlisle liked him a lot. Trenton Watford, who recently got released, I believe today by the Blazers, or I can't remember if it was a team or a player option, but he declined it. He's a free agent after only 2 seasons, only 22. He's a promising wing, but he definitely has a lot of, work to do on both sides of the ball to an extent, but his length and his size are pretty solid. And he has shown some flashes that look pretty good. I would be interested in him. Other guys, maybe Terrence Ross if THJ leaves in some sort of trade and we need to shore up the scoring a little bit, but definitely not the first option. I know he was tossed around at the trade deadline, or not the trade deadline, but the buyout market, of course, and ended up signing with the Suns. I think he probably ends up going back there on like a minimum contract or something like that. Anthony Lamb is an interesting guy from the Warriors. That is a decent 3-and-D dude. I'd like to take a flyer on him. He's like 25. He just really hasn't. He's played well in the G League. Had some issues in terms of his college career and some allegations there. But I mean, so long as he's moved past that, I'd be interested in taking a flyer on him for the right price. But not another guy that we're throwing the bag at here. Other than that, the marketive isn't really too lucrative in terms of other wings. Like you're looking at, guys that have in the past, maybe their name has been tossed around in terms of having potential, but they haven't really panned out at the NBA level. Like Mfiondu Kabengele from the Clippers, Julian Champagny, Matt Ryan, Louis King. Just a few other names to maybe look out for, like training camp invites or something like that. But I doubt anything more than that, or maybe a minimum contract. Lastly, let's go ahead and look at the center pool. Now, this obviously isn't too extensive, too deep, and but we got to do our due diligence here in evaluating all these different dudes. Now, the Mavericks are pretty limited in terms of what they can do, especially given that they're probably not going to re-sign Christian Wood. Funny enough, Christian Wood actually is slated as the third best center in free agency per Spotrac, which is interesting. But the two guys ahead of him that I would be worth even considering for the Mavericks, or I guess three that I'd be willing to consider, probably going to be Mason Plumlee, Brook Lopez, and Jakob Poeltl. With Lopez and Plumlee, and I did not even know Mason Plumlee was this old. He's been in the league for 10 years and is 33. He's a really good, sort of switchable 5, is still pretty uber athletic. Kind of what Dwight Powell would be defensively if he had length and he had the ability to flip his hips. Has that sort of body style, is a good rebounder. Doesn't really give you too much else, but would be a really good stopgap, measure starter. But I think the Clippers seem sort of poised to bring him back. So there have been rumors of Ivica Zubac being on the trade market. That's a guy to definitely monitor in terms of the Mavericks. Want to bring in a bigger bodied center. Now, he doesn't necessarily solve all the rim protection woes, but he is a bigger body. He's not a terrible rim protector, especially if you're able to play lively 20 minutes a game and you still get the output, the offensive and rebounding output of a Zubac, and you're able to sort of rotate his minutes to where he's not getting played off the floor all too often. I'd be really interested in him trade-wise because the Clippers have a lot of different options, especially with this James Harden thing potentially coming into fruition to where they may have to consolidate salary elsewhere. So he's definitely a name to keep an eye on. I've heard some stuff about Valanciunas as well from the Pelicans. So those bigger bodied centers that, are daunting, when somebody's trying to score downhill on them, but maybe necessarily don't have the most insane verticality and athleticism, even though they're huge and have good length. If the Mavericks got a guy like that who's that good offensively and rebounding wise, may have to play some drop coverage and not getting the most switchable, not the best rim protector, but definitely not too much of a slouch. Definitely, I think Zubac is a little better than Valanciunas, but both of those guys definitely keep on the monitoring market if the Mavericks are to still look for a center. But as Mark Stein reported, they may not be. So we'll see. Brook Lopez, this is a guy that was almost a defensive player of the year candidate last year. I'm hesitant to give him the full MLE because he is 35, and I just don't know how much more years he's willing to play. But if it's 3 years or under, you got to consider it, man, because Milwaukee does have his bird rights. I think that they would probably like to bring him back for sure. But if you could snag him at a decent figure, especially anything under the MLE, you got to take that and use him as the veteran center to bridge the gap till Derek Lively's ready. I just don't think the Mavericks will be in play for him. Another guy that I think will probably re-sign with Toronto, especially given they traded for him, is Jakob Poeltl. But if he somehow is not too keen as to the money that they're wanting to give him, or he is preferential to not paying state income tax, just wants to go back to Texas, not necessarily San Antonio, but Dallas. If that somehow were to happen, I would give him the full MLE for sure. He's not even 28 yet. He gives you 3, surefire years of a really good starting center that's getting a little bit better offensively every year. Not a guy that, is ever going to probably evolve into an all-star, but can still be a really good starting center who offensive game is, a little less one-dimensional as career goes on. It's getting a little bit better at sealing and posting up and still being a really good lob threat and great rim protector. I would love him here. He's one of the guys I would throw the whole MLE at for sure. But we'll just have to see how that situation goes. Another guy that, is not a big man, but I kind of forgot to mention in the sort of news roundup, Harrison Barnes is poised to go back to Sacramento. He re-signed on an extension, but if you listen to our last podcast, I was definitely keen to getting him on the MLE, but fortunately, it doesn't just seem like that's going to happen. Dwight Powell is the 5th listed center on Spotrac in terms of, the highest rated free agent center. So that's something that's pretty interesting there. I'm not mad about him coming back, but there are some younger centers on here I definitely think are worth taking a flyer on, but the Mavericks can't go into camp with too many centers. So it's all going to be dependent on if they end up giving, maybe Maxey up in a trade. They somehow let Dwight Powell walk, or some other events sort of transpire here, because these guys just may not be as realistic as some of those wings and point of attack defenders, even though the Mavericks still sorely do need a rim protector or just some more rim protection to shore up the rotation. Paul Reed is a guy that showed a lot of promise for the 76ers last year. I would really be interested in him as a guy who can also kind of guard down. He's not necessarily a tried and true big man, but he is kind of, fairly similar to Maxey, but he's only 24, a little bit maybe more athletic at this stage in his career than Maxey is as currently stands, after that hamstring tear and, getting older and stuff like that. I would really take a hard eye at him. He is a restricted free agent. I think Philadelphia is definitely poised to try to retain him on a smaller deal. Not a smaller deal than he already has, but, a team friendly sort of contract, just given the market for him. I don't think it's too huge, but I would definitely look twice at him if he's still available in free agency and you're looking at to shore out your roster, and maybe the Mavericks have gave up another big man. Other guys, Jock Landale, Drew Eubanks, Thomas Bryant, Bismack Biyombo, Chimezie Metu. Even Kevin Love, Blake Griffin, Mo Wagner, all guys that, are good rotation big men, but they don't have that, really, I guess, except in Biyombo's case, but he's so offensively limited that it almost kind of makes it counterintuitive. They just don't have that defensive pop that I think is worthwhile in terms of adding yet another center to the Mavericks. Jackson Hayes, unrestricted free agent. The Pelicans do have his bird rights. He's a rim protector, as well as a guy, that's kind of played on the wing for the Pelicans a little bit, given some of the weird log jams that they've had at the big man position. But he's definitely a prospective sort of flyer to take a look at on. He's a guy who still has a lot of potential, given he's only 23. He's been in the league for a few years, of course, but I don't think the door is completely shut on him. He has had some weird, kind of issues arise throughout his NBA career. But, if the Mavericks want to take another flyer and bring in another young big man, I would be keen to adding him for the right price, but just not, in terms of overpaying him or something like that. I think that would be malpractice on the Mavericks' part. So definitely a guy to look at, but probably more towards the back half of free agency when the Mavericks are, looking to fill out the back half of their roster. Omar Yurtseven is a guy that is in that sort of Jackson Hayes range, not as athletic, but still a really good rim protector, good rim runner, probably a better rebounder, is a little bit more of a, sort of tried and true five, but he showed a little bit promise in terms of, sort of face up, post up game with the Heat, as is kind of riddled with injuries last year. But I mean, he's a guy that has shown promise throughout decent, junctures throughout his career. He just hasn't really got the consistency in Miami. His agency is poised to find a pretty good deal for him. He's only 25, just turned 25. I'd love him to be added to the center rotation, but of course, that it's all conducive to it. The Mavericks keep the current whole center rotation, or if they expend upon it a little bit. Other than that, I mean, you're kind of looking at just fringe guys here, like a Dwayne Dedmon, like Willie Cauley-Stein, Hernan Gomez, DeAndre Jordan, Myers Leonard, like Robin Lopez, Boban, Neemias Keita, Tristan Thompson, even Mo Bamba. He's a guy that, I mean, you definitely would, be inclined to take a flyer on, given he's only 25, could still add a little bit more potential, but he hasn't developed as much as you'd like in his NBA career. But recently got his player or team option declined, I believe. So, I mean, if he'd be interesting to come in and compete with Lively and stuff, and has insane measurables, but things haven't really panned out as much as we've wanted for him. But I mean, you never know how a change of scenery could impact a guy, especially given he, just left Orlando for LA, was, had to kind of be in a weird sort of spot there with Anthony Davis. I wouldn't hate him, the Mavericks taking a flyer on him, but some of the other guys I listed right before him, those older big men, I mean, I just don't know if they add enough to the Mavericks unless they're on a sort of veteran mentorship role. And even then, I think the Mavericks just have enough big men to where it would make their fit redundant, but I mean, you never know, right? So, I mean, that kind of, wraps it up. We essentially kind of went through all the free agents. Now, obviously, there are a few names, via trade, especially big men that have been tossed around in the rumor mill that we definitely need to, monitor going forward, especially DeAndre Ayton. We talked ad nauseum about his sort of fit with the Mavericks, but I mean, look, if you can get a guy that can be a potential top 5 center on any given night who, is a really good post-up player, really good face-up player, really good rebounder, great rim protector when he's dialed in, you do that 10 times out of 10 if you're still able to keep the full MLE. But there obviously is some risk involved with Ayton. He's a bit of a sort of, I don't know how to describe his personality, maybe a rigid personality. We've seen him maybe potentially have some locker room issues in Phoenix. His how committal he is to basketball has been questioned, but I mean, given the right deal, they got to pull the trigger on that. I've seen the anonymous guy on Twitter, of course, throw out Cat to Dallas. It just doesn't seem realistic for me, but if something crazy like that ends up happening, I mean, shit, like, at that point, like we would just have to see exactly what the outgoing deal was on that. But I don't even really want to divulge into that in terms of something that is seriously noteworthy, and until we even see any credible rumor on that front. In terms of other rumors, other guys the Mavericks could maybe be in the neighborhood to trade for. It is kind of looking somewhat thin around the margins. Just other big men on decently applicable contracts that aren't going to obstruct the team too much. If the Mavericks could somehow maybe swing a trade for a Mitchell Robinson or a guy of like that caliber around that like $10 million range. I don't even know exactly what the ramifications of his contract are or anything like that. I would need to look that up, but like, I'm not even really saying necessarily him, but I mean, guys in that sort of fringe, not, I wouldn't say fringe starter range, but, good solid starters, but definitely not, fringe all-star tier, well under that, that are in that like $10 to $12 million range. always look at the Mavericks to maybe be making a move around the margins there to add that surefire starting center. I mean, we've heard the reports, but we don't know what's actually going on beyond the scenes. We don't know if, what Mark Stein's getting is completely a smokescreen. There's a lot of things that come out this time of year, and it's an exciting time of year. I am at the edge of my seat to see exactly what happens over the next 24 hours. So I really can't wait to get to it. It's been a fun episode covering everybody. Miles Turner, I didn't even mention that, but he liked a tweet regarding JJ Redick, talking about how the type of center the Mavericks need in Dallas on his podcast. And he basically gave a perfect sort of accurate descriptor for Miles Turner. So, I mean, I would love that. That is the idealistic sort of stopgap measure center that the Mavericks should bring in, but also, still definitely, has all-star potential as he's entering the prime of his career. I believe he'll be 27, 28, but Indiana would have to commit to going in a different direction, would have to be really confident in Jarius Walker, potentially getting some minutes down at the 5, would have to really like, the backup big man situation there, with some of the younger guys. If they really are looking at more of a sort of retool, I mean, maybe it's under consideration. I know Miles Turner would probably love to be in Dallas, and I would love it just as much as him. Especially if the Mavericks will pull it off, but I just don't know how much smoke is coming out of the smoke bomb with the Miles Turner rumors to Dallas, if you even want to call them rumors, as much as it's just out there on the internet, the fact that he liked that tweet. But I mean, if they could somehow pull that off, and that's just all going on beyond the scenes, and Indiana's willing to trade him, do a sign and trade, take back Dwight Powell, and maybe shore up some other areas of their roster instead, and just don't value the rim protection like that. I mean, that is a dream scenario, but we can only see what happens. We're only so limited in what we can actually hope and pray to happen. So let's just see what happens going forward. I hope the Mavericks don't screw this up, but revisionist history would tell us that they will, even though they did have a really good draft. I mean, let's hope. I'm going to give Nico the benefit of the doubt that he can, forward the momentum here and have a good free agency and trade period. And I mean, we'll be back almost every night, really until news stops coming out. There's no doubt about that, but definitely weary in the leading hours coming up to it. That history could repeat itself in this Kyrie Irving situation when, given what happened with Jalen Brunson last year. So I'm pretty nervous. Let's just see what happens. I don't really got anything else for you guys, and we need to all be praying in a circle outside the AAC on a big Mavericks towel, doing some sort of ritualistic endeavor to better our chances at this offseason going well, as I've seen kind of tossed around on Twitter. That's all we can do, guys. But this has been Will with the Mainstream Mavs podcast. Free agency is in T-minus 2 hours and 18 minutes, and I've never wanted to honestly kind of just ball up in a corner and just hibernate until it's over. Than I sort of do right now. But I mean, man, there's only so much we can do, like I keep saying. So I will stop repeating myself and go ahead and end the podcast here. It's been a fun one, and I'm very anxious to see what's going to happen. But of course, everything will have to play itself out. Make sure to follow us on Twitter at Mainstream214 to get updates on all our podcasts, all our thoughts surrounding moves as they happen. We'll be posting, I'll be up on my phone all day with all this free agency stuff coming out. But believe that. Make sure to, obviously, if you're watching on YouTube, like, comment, and subscribe on the video. It would mean a lot to us. And also, you can find us on YouTube at Mainstream Mavs Podcast. I don't even know how I forgot to mention that. Comment down below what you think the Mavericks are going to do day one of free agency. Will they re-sign Kyrie Irving? Will they not? All that good stuff. If you are listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, make sure to give us a 5-star rating, turn on those post notifications, give us a good review. We would really appreciate it if you guys are loyal listeners of the podcast and do want to give us that sort of time of day. If not, we even accept constructive feedback. We are not limited in our self-improvement. We want to take whatever tidbits and advice you guys have. So if you want to critique us and you don't even enjoy us and you just want to shed a dim light upon us and slander us on the internet, then hey, that's your prerogative. If it's even somewhat constructive, then I'll probably at least take a look at it and respond to you. And in a sort of proclamation to get better. So that's what we do around here. We are not limited to anybody's opinions on the Mainstream Mavs podcast. We love interacting with you guys. Please interact with us more on Twitter as we try to grow our Twitter back up after it got hacked. It's been a tough sort of scenario since then, but it's been a fun build up, and we've been getting out a lot of podcasts leading up to this. So the anticipation's been there for months on end since the season ended. Now we're just gonna have to see how it goes. Praying for the best. Will with the Mainstream Mavs podcast, signing out. Peace out, guys.